I think that's what we need to do. So I'd encourage everyone to figure out what is it that I can do to do that, not what is it that someone else can do, or the state can do, or the government can do, but what is it that I can do to advance the evolution of the human spirit.
My name is Cheryl Toff, a volunteer interviewer with the Kizuna Project. Today is April 5th, 2026, and I am in Tucson, Arizona. This is a continuation of the interview with Mr. Austin Yamada. Mr. Yamada, do I have permission to record you?
Yes, you do.
So, in our first segment, we talked about your father joining the Military Intelligence Service. Can you define that, please, for us and tell us more about your father's role?
Sure. The Military Intelligence Service was a covert organization that was stood up in 1941, and it was a secret organization. Its mission was to assist the Pacific Theater of Operations during the war, primarily Japanese focused. So they were looking for folks who spoke Japanese, could translate Japanese documents, could help with intercepted messages, could interrogate prisoners, and those types of activities. So it was the forerunner, and I'll mention this a little bit later, but it was the forerunner of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and Army Special Forces. So it was one of the organizations that were founded during the war for a wartime necessity that have a long legacy in the intelligence community to this day. So the MIS primarily recruited from either Japanese Americans living in Hawaii or from the internment camps. So they would come to the internment camps and interview internees to find out who might be willing to enlist in the Army. And like I mentioned earlier, I think this is one of the big ironies, that you have a covert, a highly classified military organization recruiting people who are being interned because they have been deemed a threat to national security. So it's one of the big ironies of the internment process that the Military Intelligence Service was recruiting from the very pool of people they considered to be threats to national security. So the Camp Savage, Minnesota was one of the primary location of the MIS and the language school. It's where my father did, I do remember him saying, leaving Arizona, it was 100 degrees and arriving at Camp Savage and it was 32. So he said he wasn't prepared. He got off the train, he was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and he was walking into a very cold December in Minnesota. My dad served in the research and analysis section, so he was not one of what I would call an operator. He didn't deploy. He was in an office setting, reviewing documents, providing intelligence, some I'll call it battle damage assessment, targeting information. Since he had grown up in and around Hiroshima, he had firsthand knowledge of the infrastructure of the city. So his role with the MIS was about a year. I think he was in Camp Savage. So he was an instructor at the Military Intelligence Language School. He was reassigned to support the newly founded Office of Strategic Services under General Donovan in Washington, D.C. That was sometime in 1940, late 42 or early 43. I don't have the exact time of his reassignment there. But he was reassigned as an Army intelligence officer to the Office of Strategic Services.
And can you tell us, please, what was the OSS?
So the OSS was the Office of Strategic Services, and that was created in 1942 under President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9182. Prior to that, there was no centralized intelligence service in the United States. Each military branch had its own intelligence service, and there was no centralized control of intelligence collection and foreign intelligence at the time. So the OSS was established to centralize the intelligence gathering as well as providing capabilities that the armed forces did not have at the time, things like sabotage and operating behind enemy lines. So the OSS was stood up with those missions in mind to help the war effort both in the Pacific theater and the European theater on intelligence collection and sabotage.
So, with all this in mind, what kind of personal life did your father have? For example, how did he meet your mother?
So, really good question. So, I think I mentioned earlier, I believe my father led a very happy, content Japanese American life in Orange County, running a produce business, wholesale, retail, be very active in the Japanese American community. After leaving the camp, entering the Army, working for the Military Intelligence Service, and then being stationed in Washington, D.C. during the war, I think he started thinking differently about what the future looks like for him. So he attended a serviceman's canteen hosted by a local church, Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., where servicemen stationed in D.C. were provided coffee, donuts, and conversation. My mother, the daughter of a English father and German mother, was living in Riverdale, Maryland at the time, and attended Calvary Baptist Church and volunteered at the church canteens. So that's where my father met my mother. Quite a striking difference from the previous women I've seen pictures of that he dated when he was in Southern California. My mother was she was 29 years old when she got married, so she was in her late 20s during the war. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned young lady, and my father, very Japanese American looking, had to be quite the couple in during the war, dating in Washington, D.C. But I do think it was a conscious effort on my father's part to change the direction of his future. And dating my mother, they got married in 1948. They, at that time, considered a mixed marriage, couldn't own property in Virginia. They rented an apartment in suburban Maryland for a while and ended up buying a house in Wheaton, Maryland, Silver Spring, Maryland, in late 1948, where they started their family. My older sister Sharon was born in 1950 while they were living there, and I followed in 1953. My younger brother Mark, born in 1964. So those were the three children my father had. And I'll mention this, I hadn't thought of this in a while, but when they were choosing names for their children, we asked my mother and father many years ago, how did we end up with our names? So my sister, Sharon Emmy, my mother preferred names that would not have nicknames. So she chose the name Sharon. My father wanted to have a middle name that had a tie to Japan. So Emmy, E-M-I, was my sister's middle name, which she always hated because it wasn't like everybody else's middle name. My middle name, Ken, has ties to Japanese. And my younger brother, Mark, Ray, R-E-I. So the names were very deliberately chosen that wouldn't have nicknames. There were no James or Williams or Roberts, and Japanese ties in the middle names. So that's where we grew up in Wheaton, Maryland, and Silver Spring during post-war suburbia, I'll call it. Very working class neighbors. All of my neighbors worked for the government, as I recall. Mr. Harden, Herbie Harden, worked for the Army Map Service. William Martin worked for the Department of Agriculture, so they were all government employees. And my father I'll mention this, when the war ended, the OSS was terminated, and the organization that was created to take its place was the Central Intelligence Agency. So most of the employees of the OSS, most of the civilian employees, transitioned to become employees of the Central Intelligence Agency, which my father did, which I was unaware of. Whenever I would ask my father where he worked, either out of curiosity, but I got to admit I really wasn't that curious. It was mostly to filling out forms for school or applications or other things I needed, father's occupation and workplace. And I remember very vividly the responses I would get from my father about what is your occupation? He would say, government employee. And I'd say, well, Freddie's father is a statistician, and Billy's father is a doctor. What is government employee doesn't really, he says, just put government employee. So I put down government employee. Then I'd say, where do you work? And I remember this part very distinctly, that he would say, quote, just put down State Department. And then the next time I'd ask him, he would say, just put down U.S. government. And I remember asking him, isn't the U.S. government kind of big? Don't you work for the Army or the Department of Education? Isn't there some branch that you just put down U.S. government and this phone number? And it was the just put down part that always stuck in my ear. He never said, I work for. He would just say, just put down. So I was kind of dismayed that my father didn't have a occupation like everybody else's father had. Everybody else's father had an occupation. They also had a location of employment. And my father seemed to have neither of those. So I remember being dismayed and maybe a little embarrassed that either my father didn't know where he worked, or it was so inconsequential that it didn't matter. So I more or less brushed off most of those encounters with him, but I did grow up thinking my father didn't really have an occupation and didn't really know where he worked. So I would avoid conversations with my peers about, what does your father do? All my mothers did the same thing. They were housewives. Mm-hmm. So all the mothers did the same thing, but the fathers did different things. My father didn't seem to do what everybody else's father did. So I never knew that he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency until many years later. I was home from school for the summer. I was 16 years old, home from high school. I was a sophomore in high school. Phone rang. My father said, I forgot my badge. You need to bring it to me. I said, okay. He said, it's on my dresser. I went to the bedroom, on top of the dresser. There's a badge with this picture on it. I pick it up. I say, okay, where do you work? And I'm thinking in my head, now I'm really going to find out where he works, because before he never really would tell me. He said, just bring it to me. Here are the directions. Get on the Beltway, take the Beltway to the George Washington Parkway, take George Washington Parkway south, past the Turkey Run exit. The next exit will have a little green sign. There'll be 3 letters on that sign, and it'll say BPR. Turn in there, go up to the building, and bring it to me. And I said, BPR. What does that stand for? Thinking I was really going to get to the bottom of this. He said, BPR stands for Bureau of Public Roads. And I said, oh, so you work for the Bureau of Public Roads. He said, just bring me the badge. So I got in the car, followed his directions, around the Beltway, south on George Washington Parkway, past Turkey Run. The next exit, sure enough, there's this little green sign. I can still see it. BPR. Pull in there. I pulled in, and there's a guard shack. And I was surprised that there's a guard shack for the Bureau of Public Roads. I get there, this guy in uniform with a rifle comes to my window, and he says, can I help you? and I was a little bit intimidated, but I held up my father's badge. I'm here to bring my father's badge. He said, okay, pull up to the front of the building, park on the left, and go up. So I pulled up in front of this huge building, and I'm thinking to myself, this must be the wrong place, because the Bureau of Public Roads can't be this big. But this is where he told me to park the car, go in these big doors in the front of the building, and walked into the lobby. And if you've ever seen any of those TV shows or movies with the lobby of the CIA, you see the big emblem on the floor and the stars on the wall. And I walked in and was just frozen. I'm thinking, now I know I'm in the wrong place. I'm in the wrong place. And I'm standing there thinking this when my father appears coming through the turnstile the other way, and he's walking over to me, and my mouth is just about to speak, and he sees me and he goes, we'll talk about it later, takes the badge, turns around and walks away. So that's the first day I knew my father worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, which he worked for until he retired in 1976. But in those days, there were no signs. It was very, even speaking the initial CIA was a no-no. So it was very covert, and there was no discussion of it at home. I'm not even sure my mother ever knew. So that's how I found out my dad worked for the CIA, and it took that long before I realized it.
Well, your childhood questions were certainly valid, and you eventually got your answer. Did you have any questions or understanding of what happened to your grandparents after they left the camps?
Yes, and most of what I found out from documents I was able to find in the National Archives, and I'll mention this a little bit later, but I found out that my grandfather, Jasuki, was in poor health, and at the end of the war, the internees who were still there were essentially given $25 and a bus ticket back to where they came from. That was the extent of the process to reassimilate them back into society. Of course, my grandparents had nothing to return to. Since they didn't own property, there was nothing. There was no home. There was no house. There was no address. There was no job. They had no skills. They had $25 in the bus ticket. So they ended up back in California, living with family and friends. My grandfather Jasuki was, like I said, in poor health. There's a telegram that I found in my father's files from the War Relocation Authority informing my father that his father had attempted suicide, and he was in the hospital. He had survived the attempt, but he was in the hospital. Later learned that he was released, but he did not live very long. He passed in 1946, destitute, so he had no money. And I have receipts that my father sent for the funeral in Orange County. So my Jasuki passed in 1946. My grandmother lived with family and friends in the Los Angeles area, and actually appeared in a TV show that was popular at the time. There was a show called Queen for a Day. And the premise of the show was that they would bring these contestants on. I think, as I recall, there was 3. Each contestant would tell their tale of woe. Here's why I need to be queen for a day, because I've suffered this, that, and here's my wish that I would want granted if I were queen for a day. So somehow my grandmother, Sewa, got to be a contestant on the show. And her tale of woe was that she had lost everything in the internment, and that she had lived in the camp from May of 1942 until the camp was closed in the summer of 1945. So 3 years spent in the camp and sent back to California with $25, and that her wish would be to see her only grandchild, Austin Yamada. and the show was the premise of the show was that the winner would be determined by audience applause. So whoever's case was the most heartfelt would get the highest applause. So unfortunately, my grandmother was not selected. She did not get the most applause that day. So she was not queen for a day. But subsequently, my father was able to finance her trip to Silver Spring, Maryland, where I remember meeting her. It must have been around 1959 or 60. I was 6 or 7 years old, I think. And I remember my father saying, "This is my mother." And this woman was very, very tiny, 5 feet tall, very frail, maybe 90 pounds, spoke no English. But all I remember is her smile. And she had the biggest smile. And that was my grandmother. So that's how I met her. That was her wish come true, as meeting her grandchild after the war. She lived until into her 90s before she passed in Southern California, and I think I have the receipts from my father from that funeral as well. So that's it's kind of a sad ending to my grandparents' lives, because I think they were, doing fairly well before the war. They were living on their own and running their own business, and after the war they had nothing. And although the War Relocation Authority was responsible for storing personal possessions for internees, they came back, and as my father, I asked him whatever happened to all the, said the trunks had been broken into and everything value taken, so there was really nothing. So, and I think my father had great guilt about not only what happened to his parents, but the fact that they suffered physical attacks while in the camp. After the war, they were, I'll say, ostracized somewhat. My father still had this label as being an informant, and of betraying the Japanese American society there. So I think my father bore a lot of guilt for that. He made a trip back to Southern California once or twice, never stayed, never took the family, and was clearly, in my mind, looking back, I think, cutting the ties, and didn't want to wasn't part of the Japanese American community there any longer. He had his own life and his own family ahead of him in Silver Spring, Maryland. And that's, looking back, I'm pretty confident that the internment, his enlistment, and his meeting my mother were all very conscious decisions to veer away from the life that he had lived before the war and start building a new life after the war.
So, with all of these changes for the family, what was life like for you growing up in post-war suburbia with a Japanese father and a Caucasian mother?
Yeah, it was interesting. I gotta admit, I didn't notice I was any different, but my classmates at school sure did, and I would get teased about having slanty eyes, and I remember coming home and asking. I think my mother and father were both there, and this is the dining room table at night, and asking, "Am I Chinese? Am I Japanese?" Kids in school are asking me, if I'm Chinese or Japanese. What am I? And I remember real distinctly the answer I got, and the answer I got was, "You're American." And that seemed to satisfy me. I was kind of relieved. Oh, well, good to know. Don't know where you work, but at least I'm American. So I felt better that I was American, but there was so many unknowns and so many uncertainties, because my father didn't look like everybody else's father. He didn't talk like everybody else's father. He didn't know, the difference between a double dribble and a double play like everybody else's father. So I was a little bit, I'll say embarrassed. My father was not like everybody else's father. My mother, on the other hand, was like everybody else's mother. My father wasn't, and that I remember maybe even resenting the fact that how come my family's not like everybody else's family. So it was, I won't say it was tough. I did not have a tough childhood by any stretch. I did get teased at school a little bit, but not to the extent that it really scarred me or anything. But I do remember my father's answer, you're not Japanese American, you're American. So that was really my elementary school and high school memories. We didn't pal around a lot, my father and I, but he was very proud of me, and he would take every opportunity to come to my football games and to come to my school activities if I had anything, and he was very proud. And looking back, I think he was seeing the future and going. He deliberately made decisions in his life that would affect his children, and he was starting to see them come true. That's how I feel.
Well, it could be argued that as tough as his decisions were, he helped speed the end of the war. So given all that he had been through, did he receive any compensation for his internment?
The compensation question started almost as soon as the war was over. But it took many years for it to catch hold and to get some political might behind it. My father did write a letter to President Reagan that he asked me to help him compose. That's how I know this letter. And I'm going to read it to you verbatim. And I will admit, I helped my father write this. He didn't dictate it, but he told me what he wanted it to say. So this is what we wrote to President Reagan in March of 1987. My father writes, I am an American citizen by birth, born in California of Japanese ancestry. In 1942, at the age of 32, my family and I were interned in a wartime relocation camp with 120,000 fellow Japanese Americans. I was at the Gila River Relocation Center in Poston, Arizona. My family and I suffered great personal losses, both financial and emotional. But I was a young man then, with faith in my country, and believed that eventually our loyalty and patriotism would be affirmed, and our sacrifices acknowledged. Although deeply disappointed and opposed to this internment, I fully cooperated with the authorities and worked as a recreational worker while in the camp. However, I wanted to get out of the camp and get my family out too. In order to accomplish this goal, while at the same time serving my country, I enlisted in the Army. I remained in the Army until after the war in 1946, and subsequently served with the federal government for 25 years, retiring in 1971. I am now 77 years old, with children and grandchildren, and I would like to see the day when my great country acknowledges the transgressions against American citizens of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast during World War II. Therefore, I implore you to support the implementation of the recommendation of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. Respectfully, Hatsumi Yamada. So he and I wrote that letter. He had confidence that the bill would be passed, but unfortunately passed away of cancer prior to the bill being passed. He and I had a conversation before he died about, we still weren't sure there would be any compensation, but he said, if there is, this is what I want you to do. I want you to split whatever money there is, and half of it should go to the Garden Grove Baptist Church, because that's where the location where some of the family personal items were stored during the war. And the other half should go to the creation of a memorial in Washington, D.C. about the internment of Japanese Americans. So we had the conversation, and I want to read a little bit about of President Reagan's comments that he made before Congress when the bill was passed, because I think he nailed it, and he got that my dad would have been pleased to hear these words spoken. President Reagan says, "The members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was at war, struggling for its survival. And it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States. Indeed, scores of Japanese Americans volunteered for our armed forces, many stepping forward from the internment camps themselves. The 442nd Regiment Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, served with immense distinction to defend this nation, their nation. Yet back at home, the soldiers' families were being denied the very freedom for which so many of the soldiers themselves were laying down their own lives." President Reagan went on to say, "The legislation that I'm about to sign provides for restitution payments to each of the 60,000 surviving Japanese Americans of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years." So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. And I think if my father had heard President Reagan speak those words, he would be satisfied that he achieved his goal. My father and I had another conversation shortly before he passed away, and the words that stuck in my head are, he looked at me and he said, "You have to be strong." And it wasn't until I started researching a little bit of my father's past and his upbringing and while he was in Japan, and the samurai-like qualities that he learned from his family during his formative years. It's such a strong ethical and moral lifestyle that I think he was trying to pass on, and he did. And I've looked up some of the Bushido, the way of the warrior, that emphasize honor, self-discipline, and loyalty, strength, justice, courage, all those traits that my father exhibited during his life that I was unaware of. I was, living my American childhood and was just, I'll say, blissfully unaware of what a hero my father was to his family and what he did for his country. And I hope to pass along some of this that I've been able to research to my family so that they can appreciate how their ancestors helped give them opportunities that they otherwise would not have had.
So with this fabulous foundation that your father and your ancestors gave you, what brought you to Tucson?
So my career was formed, I'll say, by accident. So after I graduated from college, and I'll admit I went to college to become a ski instructor. So I actually selected the university I'd go to by the school that had the highest, the ski resort with the highest vertical drop times the number of stable ski days per year, divided by its proximity to campus. And I ended up at Montana State University studying earth science. And my goal was to graduate with a college degree and to get a job at a ski resort, which I did. So I graduated with a degree in earth science, and I took my first job at the Big Sky Ski Resort in Big Sky, Montana. As it turns out, achieving your goal isn't always as satisfying as you think it might be. So after one season at Big Sky, shoveling snow and freezing, it gets real cold there, I decided that maybe ski instructor wasn't the career I should ultimately pursue. So I applied for a job with the federal government. And in those days, there was something called the Professional Administrative Career Examination that was administered by OPM. It was basically taking your educational background and then what I'll call an aptitude test to find out what government occupational series you were qualified to be hired, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. So I took the Professional Administrative Career Examination and was notified by the OPM that I was eligible to be hired as a Technical Information Specialist. Didn't know what that was, but I said, okay, now what? Now you wait for an agency that wants to hire a Technical Information Specialist, and you wait until your name bubbles up to the top of the list, then they'll call you. So I waited about a year and finally got a call from the Defense Mapping Agency. The Defense Mapping Agency says, we're not offering you a job, but if we were, would you accept it? I always like these government conversations. So I said, I have one question. Yeah. Is it indoors? And the answer was yes. I said, I'll take it. So I left Big Sky, Montana, and arrived in Bethesda, Maryland to a job that started with the Defense Mapping Agency. Reported to work on June 8th of 1978 and walked into the HR office at the time. There was a young lady there, and she said, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the best of your abilities? And I remember hearing that and going, holy cow, what am I getting myself into? I wasn't aware that was an oath of service that all government employees take. So it got me to thinking. I said, absolutely, yes, I am willing to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And she said, great, now you have to fill out this form for a top secret clearance. I said, what is this job? Never mind, just fill out the form and go sit over there. So I filled out the form. At that time, it took about 6 months to get processed for a security clearance. Finally get a security clearance, and they tell me what I'm about to do, and I set out on a career as a technical information specialist. And over the course of the next 25 years, I became a cartographer and a physical scientist and a program manager and an intelligence officer and a program manager. And at the end of 25 years, I retired as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. All of those jobs, all of those opportunities appeared in front of me. I didn't seek them out. And they were all, behind them all, I could hear my father's footsteps. That, holy cow, how fortunate am I to have these opportunities just presented in front of me. So I had what I would call a very exciting and satisfying career with the federal government. 25 years worth, mostly spent in the Pentagon, mostly classified jobs. And I became very proud of what we were doing and how we were doing it, and ended up retiring because I I didn't agree with some of the politicalization of decisions that were being made at the highest level within the Pentagon. And I knew my answers were going to end up having me be retired, but I was happy to do them because I remembered that oath I took on the first day of employment. So I retired from the federal government in 2003. I had achieved much more than I ever thought I would. Like I said, I retired as a member of the Senior Executive Service Level 3, which is actually the highest level you can attain without being a political appointee. So I was very proud of that. I wasn't willing to barter with the oath I took in order to remain. So I left on a Friday, retired on a Sunday, and went to work for a series of what I call the usual suspects in the defense industry. These are Lockheed Martins and Mantech Internationals and Kinetic North Americas, where I did the typical thing that senior government officials do, and they become advisors on security and on strategy and how the companies can help support the Defense Department. So I did that for about 10 years until the phone rang one day, and it was Virginia Tech. And the guy on the other end of the line said, "Austin, we are creating an ability for the research enterprise at Virginia Tech to be able to support the Department of Defense. And we'd like to know if you'd be willing to help us." Since I have a degree from Virginia Tech in remote sensing and analytical photogrammetry, they play that card. They say, "Don't you want to give back?" So I accepted, and I went to work for a man who was building this capability at Virginia Tech to leverage their research enterprise into applications that have direct impact on national security, which I felt was a worthwhile endeavor. So I helped stand that up, and while I was doing that, a couple of representatives from the University of Arizona knocked on the door. They said, "Hey, we got this university in Tucson, Arizona, and we have a big research enterprise, and we think we can contribute more to national security, and we want you to help us come figure out how to do it." And so I listened to their story, and honestly, I probably couldn't have found Tucson, Arizona on a map, but I took a plane, came out here, and the first thing I wanted to do was convince myself that if this was the best job in the world, that I could actually live in Tucson, Arizona. Talking to a boy from inside the Beltway, in suburban Maryland. So I came out here, spent about a week or two in Tucson, didn't even set foot on campus because I didn't want to cloud my thinking. I wanted to figure out whether Tucson was a livable place. And I met people here, and I said, "Darn, I like the feel. It feels like a small town. There's not the traffic. There's not the pressure. People smile a lot." So then I went down to the university and I asked them, "What do you got to offer the Defense Department?" They said, "Well, we have the #1 optical science department in the country." I said, "That's a good start. We've got a burgeoning cyber operations program." I said, "That's a good start. We got 2 hypersonic wind tunnels." So I started realizing that the tie between the research enterprise at the University of Arizona and the Defense Department's RDT&E, research, development, technology, and evaluation needs aligned pretty well. So I said, I think there are things that can be done to better align the university's research enterprise with the Defense Department's needs. So I came out here, accepted a position to lead the Defense and Security Research Institute at the University of Arizona. It wasn't long before I determined that what was really limiting the impact was the classification of the work being done. Almost all universities operate at an unclassified level and are therefore not attractive partners for the Defense Department when they're looking for technological contributions to classified programs. So I put a lot of thought into how we might fix that. And the approach that I recommended, that we ended up taking, was to create a separate legal entity, a nonprofit 501c3 corporation that would leverage the university's research enterprise, $500 million research enterprise, and be able to operate in a way that satisfied the Defense Department security regulations. So we stood that up, and I'm proud to say we successfully established a book of business. So the university works a lot of programs for the Defense Department through the University of Arizona Applied Research Corporation. So that's what got me out here. It's now transitioned to become the John Kyle Institute for National Security. So I think there are more great things are going to come. But I look back on at the time, my ties to Arizona. My father spent time in Arizona, not of his own free will, in 1942. And here I returned years later, decades later, and helped establish a capability that will support the university and the Defense Department for years to come. So I'm really proud of that we were able to accomplish that. When I say we, I feel my father behind me all the time, pushing me ahead. I think of the sacrifices he made in order to make his contribution to serve his country. And while I never wore a uniform, I feel like I've spent the last 48 years serving the nation and helping to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I took it seriously. I still take it seriously. Very proud of what we've been able to accomplish here. And I think we owe a lot to people whose stories have been lost, like my father's. I'm finding out more and more all the time. But I think we're finding out more and more how stories that have been lost helped create the environment and the opportunity for us to make the contributions that are being made today.
Given the significance and ironies of your family's contribution to this country and how that has come forward through your own life and career, do you have any advice to viewers of this program to help transmit their family histories, to build on the principles that you discussed earlier? How would you like us to go from this interview?
So a couple of things come to mind. The first is I found out a lot of what I've shared with you today through time I've spent in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., going through the War Relocation Authority files that are kept there on every individual who was interned during the war. So I visited the archives probably every day for 3 or 4 weeks and drew from the files of my father and his parents and gleaned a lot of information that I've shared with you today, but there's a lot more there. So for one thing, there's a pillar out front of the National Archives, and there's a quote that says, what is past is prologue. So I encourage people to think about that. What can we learn from the past that we can help make a better future for us? So one, think about that. Do we ever learn from past mistakes? I'm hoping the answer is yes, we can. Yes, we do. And the other is, if you do have the opportunity to look into some of the files of family members who are there, and I think you have to be a family member or one of the descendants of an internee to get access to the files, but do it. It's a treasure trove of information. I did it quite a few years ago, and the files at that time were all paper. There may have been some microfiche, but I believe now it's got to be easier to access. So I'd encourage people who have the interest to go uncover what they can find out about their family. So that's one thing I would mention. The other thing I would say is the first week I was in Arizona, I came to Arizona in 2015. The first week I was here, I drove from Tucson to Poston, Arizona. And while there is no Poston, Arizona, there is a marker. So it's south of Parker, on the Colorado River Indian Reservation. There is a monument that stands near the site of the barracks that were built at Poston. And it's a big concrete pillar that stands on the roadside there. And I found a couple of things interesting about it. One, it's on land owned by the Colorado River Indian Reservation tribe. Two, it was funded by the Japanese American Citizens League, I think of Orange County, but I could be mistaken, and the Colorado River Indian tribe. None of it was financed by the state of Arizona, which I found interesting, that the state didn't, or in the federal government didn't see a need to recognize the site where so many people were interned, and such a injustice was done. So that's one thing. But there is a quote on the concrete pillar that stands out there that I found to be, that hits the mark. So I'll read it to you. It says, "May it serve as a constant reminder of our past, so that Americans in the future will never again be denied their constitutional rights. And may the remembrance of that experience serve to advance the evolution of the human spirit." And I just found that to be so precise and so meaningful. So that's the advice I would give to people. Let's learn from some of the things that maybe people didn't get quite right, and we forgive them for those mistakes. Like President Reagan said, that was a time of war. The nation was had to make some tough decisions. But going forward, let's learn from that. And the phrase, advance the evolution of the human spirit, I think that's what we need to do. So I'd encourage everyone to figure out what is it that I can do to do that? Not what is it that someone else can do, or the state can do, or the government can do, but what is it that I can do to advance the evolution of the human spirit? So I think it's quite a powerful challenge to all of us to figure out what our role is and how we do it. And this interview and this project, I think, has inspired me to do more with the things I have found out, and I intend to leave some sort of legacy for my family, if no one else, so that they understand a little bit more about the impact of the sacrifices that were made to enable them to enjoy the things that they're enjoying now, and to meet the future. So that's what I would hope to leave people with.
Mr. Yamada, thank you very much. You have brought great honor to your family and our nation, and we are very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Sharon.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And this is the end of our interview. Thank you very much.